Today we are studying from Exodus chapter 1. And before we get into that lesson, I want us to kind of think about the subjects of heroes. Who was your hero growing up? Come on, all of us had one. All of us had someone that we looked up to. Someone that we said, that's who I want to be. Don't we? We look back at, some of us looked up to our dads and that was our first hero. Or we looked on TV and we saw celebrities and baseball players, some kind of sports hero. Or maybe it was one of those mythic kind of characters, those comic book superheroes, right? Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the man of steel, Superman. We love heroes, don't we? And as we get older, we kind of lose those heroes, don't we? Think about it. What would be your superhero power? It's fun to think about, right? If you could choose any superhero power, what would it be? Now, hands down, probably all of us, the first thing that we would want would be the ability to fly. Just to be able to go, all right, it's 5 o'clock and I got to drive home from work. See ya. Be great, wouldn't it? To be able to fly, to have the power over the air and to be like the fowl of the air and to be able to fly like Superman. And it probably, some of us, I don't know if you remember the great American hero, he was always not very good at flying. He was always crashing into stuff. But the ability to fly, to be invisible, to have X-ray vision, telekinesis, to be able to crawl the walls, to be able to have super senses, to have superhuman strength, the Hulk, He-Man, Superman, to be able to predict things, to have speed, to be fast, to have the power of healing. And then some of these superhero powers, they get into all kinds of things in the comic book world. I mean, they get very specific. There's hundreds of them. And they get really geeky, like bone manipulation, echolocation, vortex breath, sonic scream, matter ingestion, whatever that means. But there's all kinds of superhero powers, right? But what does it mean, really, to be a hero? And have we lost a true sense of what a hero really is? Once again, we turn our minds and we see what society and culture at large likes to put as heroes. And it is something to do with celebrity, isn't it? It's actors, it's musicians, it's sports heroes. And a lot of times we pay them exorbitant amounts of money. And then we have these everyday heroes like teachers, like ambulance drivers, like nurses. And meanwhile, we pay these people over here millions and millions of dollars to entertain us, but yet here people are saving lives. What does it mean to be a hero? And there's some people who are just heroes and we don't even know why. They don't really do anything but have a picture on the internet or be a celebrity. Joseph Campbell once said, a hero is someone who has given his or her life to something bigger than oneself. And of course, whatever that bigger something is really matters, doesn't it? And who is a true hero? I want us to look at the book of Exodus because the first thing that we think about when we think about the book of Exodus is who's the hero? Who's the hero of Exodus? Why, most of us say it's Moses. And of course, Moses is a hero. He was a person of phenomenal faith. He was someone who did great things. But there's other people who were heroes in the story. And the first set of heroes that we rarely ever talk about is a set of midwives. That the first people who take on Pharaoh isn't the shepherd Moses, but it's a couple of midwives of Hebrew descent. Think about that. Think about how profound of a difference that is. That here you have two women taking on Pharaoh. One of the things we want to point out from the story as it begins is how things changed in Egypt. Remember when the children of Israel came to Egypt, Joseph was one of the leaders. He was essentially second in charge. But something happened. That a new Pharaoh rose up, it says. In verse 8, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. One thing that happened, leadership changed. How important is leadership? In fact, John Maxwell said, everything rises and falls on leadership. And that's what happened in Egypt, didn't it? Once the new leader came into power, once the new Pharaoh came into power, the circumstances and the situation for the people of Israel changed dramatically. They were once welcomed into the country. They once were a part of the country. They once were a part of the salvation of the world through Egypt. But now there was a new Pharaoh, a new leader, and things have changed. How important is leadership? It's the most important. Who leads our homes? Who leads our churches? Who leads our society, our country? It is important who our leaders are. And maybe there's been a change in our own country to where there's been a Pharaoh to rise that knows Joseph no more. Number 2, injustice is rooted in fear and lust for power. Look at verses 10 through 14. What happens to this new Pharaoh? He sees the people, they're mighty, verse 9. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Injustice begins with fear, doesn't it? The Pharaoh was afraid that the people would multiply so greatly that then they would rise up against them and leave the land. That's where injustice begins. This lust for power and also fear of those who are different than us. What else happens? Injustice begets injustice. That once you start down that road of hurting people and taking advantage of people, what happens? It just snowballs, doesn't it? And that's what you find in Exodus. Look at verses 15 and 16. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah and the name other Puah. When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women and see them on their birth stools, if it is a son, then you shall kill him. So it went from slavery to now Pharaoh is killing the male children. Injustice begets injustice. It gets worse and worse and worse. So what do we find? Even amidst this terrible situation in Egypt, to where this Pharaoh was trying to domineer and have power over these people, the people of Israel, God's people, we find these midwives, and it says, but the midwives feared God. That even though their backs were against the wall, and that even though the law of the land, the state, said, do this, what was their response? They disobeyed. They disobeyed the Pharaoh's command because it was unjust. It was wrong. It's wrong to kill male children, isn't it? And they refused. First thing that we can learn here is that, number one, God's law supersedes man's law. Doesn't it? And here we have the midwives resisting in civil disobedience. They're not making war with him, but they are refusing to do what he says. Dr. King once said, one has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. You see, sometimes the state can have its definitions and they be at odds with what God says. And in the event that the state says something different than what God says, we do what God says to do. That the state is not the arbiter of what is good and evil, is it? You know, we look at what happens in this world, and the lines have gotten blurry, haven't they? And we like to say everything's gray, but there are lines of demarcation between what is wrong and what is right. We take this idea here, there is a sanctity to life. That life itself, human life, is inviolable. And that no one has the power over life except for God Himself. And it doesn't matter what the state says, or what a Pharaoh says, or what a king says, or any person of power. Human dignity and value is predicated on God's creating man. And it is different. You know, if we were to believe in what naturalism tells us, that there is no God, then all of us are just mere animals. And that there is no distinct human dignity. We're just animals. Do what you want to do. Animals do all kinds of terrible things to each other, don't they? But you don't find policemen out there trying to police animals, do you? Why? Because we understand that they are not morally accountable, but humans are. That there is a morality to us that supersedes legality. If we're just animals, then morals are just illusory. They're not real. They're just what we made up. But yet in our experience every day, we know for certain that there is a wrong and a right, and that there is a sanctity to human life. God's law supersedes man. Number two, God's providence intercedes. You see, God has a plan for the people of Israel. God has a plan that will happen. And God's plans are never thwarted or changed, even against a Pharaoh. God's providence steps it out. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things that are mighty. So think about that. These midwives versus the Pharaoh. But God has chosen the weak things to confound the mighty. Pharaoh being so strong, so mighty, having an army, but yet he can't make these midwives change their convictions. God is working in our lives. God's working in your life. Think about the life of Joseph. That during his life he had all these terrible things happen. He was sold into slavery. He ended up in jail. But yet by the end of his life, when he's reconciled with his brothers, he says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me. But God meant it for good in order to bring about, as it is this day, to save many people's lives." All those troubles and all those trying circumstances that Joseph went through was really God's hand leading him where he needed to be, where he was supposed to be. And God can accomplish a lot through less. And that's usually how He works. He doesn't choose the powerful. He doesn't choose the mighty. He chooses the small things to confound the mighty. There was a 13-year-old girl that got a diary for her birthday. Something that happens all the time. Something that's not that significant. In fact, one of her first things that she wrote in her diary, writing a diary is really a strange experience for someone like me. Not only because I've never written anything before, but also because it seems to me that later on neither I nor anyone will be interested in the musings of a 13-year-old girl. But yet that diary was written by a girl by the name of Anne Frank. A small little diary of a little girl became a first-hand testimony to the atrocities and the terrible things that were happening in Nazi Germany. And also spoke to the spirit of humanity. God can accomplish a lot through a little. We see women of faith intervening in this terrible situation. How important are our women here in the church? So very important. And these women stood up against the Pharaoh. And not only did he intervene through these two women, there's Moses' mother, there's Pharaoh's daughter, and there's also Moses' sister. In fact, the whole story of Exodus depends on women being faithful to God. There would be no Moses if there wasn't these women staying faithful to God in the most trying of circumstances. Women of faith intervening. And ultimately, isn't that how God intervenes now? Is through His people, through His church. God wants us to intervene. Number 4, God's redemption succeeds. That even though the power of the known world, the Egypt and Pharaoh and all those mighty things, God's plan of redemption succeeds. Moses becomes Moses. He delivers his people. He emancipates his people. And not only that, it goes on to victory in the Canaan. God blesses their obedience. Sometimes a lot of folks look to the excuse that the ladies make. Remember, Pharaoh recognizes that they've disobeyed. And we find in verse 19 that they have an excuse. And some have countered that this is a lie. Look, verse 19. And the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them. Many have pointed out, well, aren't they lying? And so there is this kind of conundrum here of where they tell an untruth, but yet they're obeying. You see, there's grace amidst imperfect obedience. And in fact, all of us fit into that category, don't we? And there was only one who fulfilled God's law completely and perfectly, and that was Christ Jesus. But God was able to complete and accomplish His will even amidst imperfect obedience. So what's the takeaways today? What's the application? How can we be true heroes? Number 1, be present. That's the hardest thing to be, isn't it? Truly present where you are. Because a lot of times we're never where we are. We're always thinking about something else, somewhere else, at another time. We don't live in the moment. Well, I've got to eat lunch. Well, yesterday I was doing this. We're either thinking about the past or we're thinking about the future, and here we have this moment going by and we're not here. These women were present in the moment. They lived relevant lives. They were engaged with their society, weren't they? Being present. Number 1. Number 2, having the presence of mind. That even amidst the circumstances, they still had their values. They still had their morals. They still feared God, even though Pharaoh was against them. They were also patient. It wasn't about their own survival anymore, was it? It was about the survival of these male children. It was about the survival of their people. They were empathetic, and they put someone else first. They were patient. They persevered. They were courageous. That even amidst this challenge, they still stuck to their guns and they still did what was right. Courage is being scared to death, but saddling up anyway. That's John Wayne. There's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John Wayne. And lastly, they were progressive. They were progressive because they weren't going to take the will of the Pharaoh. They were going to do what was right. And doing what's right is always progressive. It's not backwards. It's not old-fashioned. It's not old-time. No, doing what's right is the way of the future, because we're talking about eternity. We're talking about God. We're talking about heaven. So if you're truly progressive, you do what's right. C.S. Lewis said, progress means getting near to the place you want to be. And if you have taken a wrong turning, then to go forward does not get you any nearer. If you're on the wrong road, progress means doing a about turn and walking back onto the right road. In that case, the man who turns his back soonest is the most progressive man. If you're on the wrong road, staying on it doesn't mean you're more progressive. It's the person who turns around and goes the right direction. God's law supersedes. God's women intercede. His providence intervenes, and His redemption plan succeeds. Unsung heroes. Women who had faith in a time of the faithless. Do you have faith this morning? This world won't get any easier. There's going to be times where we'll be challenged. There'll be times where we won't know what to do. But we need to look to women like this who feared God, and amidst their trials and amidst their circumstances, feared God and disobeyed Pharaoh. We need that kind of courage today. Do you have that courage to turn to God in faith? Without faith it is impossible to please Him, for he that cometh to God must believe that He is a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. To repent, to turn from sin, from all those things that destroy us, to confess Jesus as the Son of God, the Messiah. And ultimately, that's what we're marching towards in this story. What if Pharaoh eradicated all the male children? What if he did destroy the people of Israel? There would be no Christ. But God's providence stepped in, and there is a Christ. Christ overcame history. Christ overcomes today, and Christ will overcome in the future. If you obey Him, you can be a part of that. Be baptized in His body, the church. Or maybe you're a Christian, but you've wrestled with things and you need prayer, you need strength, you need healing. Whatever your desire is, won't you come now as together we stand and as we sing.